Before the glass slipper, before the palace, there was a story far older, and much darker, than the fairy tale we were told. Once upon a time. The ashes were never just ashes. They were the slow erasure of a child who had once been seen, heard, and held. Cinderella remembered that time only in fragments now. A voice humming while brushing her hair. Hands that adjusted her dress before visitors arrived. Laughter that filled the rooms without effort. Those memories did not hurt because they were gone. They hurt because they proved something better had once existed. After her mother's death, the house did not change all at once. That was the cruelty of it. Loss arrived gradually, like a cold settling into stone walls. Her father tried to maintain routine, believing structure could replace warmth. Meals were eaten at the same time. Candles were lit each evening. But grief hollowed him out, leaving behind a man who looked present but lived elsewhere. When he remarried, he did so quietly, almost apologetically. The woman he chose did not raise her voice or demand attention. She observed first. She learned the house, the rhythms, the silences. She understood quickly that authority did not need force if it controlled comfort. She smiled when appropriate. She praised when others were watching. And when they were alone, she reorganized Cinderella's world piece by piece. It began with small adjustments. A room reassigned. A dress deemed impractical. A task added to the morning routine. Cinderella complied without complaint. Children adapt faster than they resist. Each change taught her something important that questioning only delayed the inevitable. The stepsisters arrived soon after, carrying their own expectations. They were not born cruel. They were taught that the world existed to respond to them. They learned that inconvenience was an injustice, and that effort was something others performed on their behalf. Cinderella became part of the furniture to them. Present. Useful. Unnoticed. As years passed, Cinderella's name was spoken less and less. When it was replaced by something mocking, the house accepted it easily. Names, after all, only matter when someone insists on remembering them. Cinderella did not insist. Survival required invisibility. Her days blurred together. Before sunrise, she cleaned. After sunset, she worked. Ash coated her skin and lungs, becoming part of her. Mirrors were rare, but when she caught her reflection in water or glass, she barely recognized herself. Not because she looked different, but because no one had ever taught her to look at herself with care. What remained constant was silence. Silence during meals she did not share. Silence when orders were given. Silence when punishment came in the form of exclusion rather than pain. Silence taught her restraint. It taught her patience. It taught her that endurance was quieter than rebellion, and far more effective. When the announcement of the royal festival reached the town, it was carried by excitement. Bells rang. Streets filled with speculation. In her house, the air sharpened. The stepmother moved with urgency. Dresses were chosen. Shoes were inspected. Futures were discussed openly, as if they were already decided. Cinderella listened while scrubbing the floor. She knew the festival was not meant for her. It was not refusal that hurt. It was certainty. No one needed to tell her she would not go. The decision had been made years ago. On the night of the festival, the house transformed. Light replaced shadows. Perfume covered the smell of smoke. The stepsisters paraded their anticipation, rehearsing smiles and glances. Cinderella helped them prepare, her hands steady, her face unreadable. When they left, the house fell quiet again. Cinderella returned to the hearth. As she always did. She did not cry. Tears required hope, and hope had long been trained out of her. She sat among the ashes, listening to the fire settle, believing that this moment was the shape of her entire life. That was when the world shifted, not with spectacle, but with inevitability. The old stories describe magic as sudden and dazzling. This was neither. This was the slow correction of an imbalance that had been allowed to grow too large. Cinderella stood, not because she was invited, but because remaining seated no longer made sense. What carried her to the festival was not joy. It was momentum. She arrived unnoticed at first, standing at the edge of a room built on ambition. Every smile was practiced. Every laugh was calculated. Cinderella did none of it. And because she did not reach outward, she was seen. The prince noticed her stillness before her beauty. In a hall full of motion, she was an anchor. They spoke briefly. He asked questions that mattered. She answered honestly, without ornament. When familiarity threatened to grow, she left. She returned again. And again? Always vanishing before she could be claimed. Each absence deepened the impression she left behind. On the final night, she fled too quickly. A glass slipper remained where she had stood. She did not return for it. She understood the cost of being found. The search began as ritual, not romance. The kingdom framed it as destiny, but those involved understood it as elimination. The slipper was not an invitation. It was a test. One by one, women were summoned, measured, assessed. Their worth reduced to whether they could fit into a fragile mold left behind by someone who had refused to stay. Cinderella heard about it the way she heard about most things indirectly. A passing comment, a burst of laughter. The stepmother did not forbid her from listening. There was no need. Prohibition implies temptation. Cinderella had been trained to assume exclusion without instruction. When the messenger arrived at the house, formality filled the air. The stepsisters competed loudly, convinced the world was finally responding to them properly. Cinderella prepared them in silence, fastening buttons, smoothing fabric, adjusting shoes that were never meant to last. The slipper appeared last. Light caught inside it. Not because it was magical, but because it was empty. It had weight only in what others projected onto it. The stepsisters lunged for the moment, forcing feet forward, reshaping themselves through pressure and denial. Pain was endured proudly. Failure followed anyway. The stepmother watched carefully. She did not intervene. She understood probability. She understood that obsession narrows vision. When it was clear the slipper would not accept what was offered, the room shifted uncomfortably. Something had gone wrong with the story everyone expected. The messenger hesitated. Protocol required completeness. "Is there anyone else?" he asked, already knowing the answer he would be given. The stepmother smiled with precision. "No." The word landed cleanly. Efficient. Final. Cinderella remained near the hearth. Ash streaked and unnoticed. She did not move. Movement invited attention. Attention invited consequence. The system functioned because everyone played their part. But systems fail at the edges. The messenger looked again. Not at the room, but at the silence within it. At the figure who had not attempted to insert herself into the narrative. He asked a second time. Slower now. The question was no longer procedural. It was curious. The stepmother's smile tightened. Denial. Repeated. Begins to sound defensive. Cinderella was called forward reluctantly. Like an error being acknowledged. She approached without expectation. The slipper was placed before her with no ceremony. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. Her foot fit. There was no gasp, no thunder, just the quiet sound of something aligning with what it had already chosen. The room reacted unevenly. Shock fractured into disbelief. Disbelief into anger. The stepmother recalculated too late. Authority is fragile when exposed. The messenger bowed. The rules had been followed. Cinderella was escorted away before the house could reassert itself. Before explanations could be demanded. Before control could be restored. She did not look back. The palace received her politely, not warmly. Politeness is distance disguised as respect. She was cleaned, dressed, presented. Everyone spoke carefully around her, as if sudden movement might break the illusion. Cinderella said little. She had learned long ago that observation was safer than participation. The prince recognized her immediately, not because of the slipper, but because she did not reach for him. Recognition passed between them without urgency. This was not reunion. This was confirmation. What followed was negotiation disguised as celebration. Titles were discussed. Timelines proposed. Futures drafted by others. Cinderella listened as she always had. The difference now was choice. On the night before the announcement, she stood alone in a room larger than her entire childhood. Mirrors surrounded her. For the first time, she was forced to look. Not at beauty, at presence. She understood then that being found was only the beginning. And beginnings, she knew, were dangerous. Power did not announce itself when it arrived. It settled in quietly, like dust on polished floors. Cinderella learned quickly that the palace was not a refuge from control, only a refinement of it. Where her stepmother had ruled through scarcity, the court ruled through abundance. Attention, gifts, expectation, all of it conditional. She was watched constantly, not guarded, but observed. Servants learned her habits. Advisors noted her silences. Every movement was recorded as potential meaning. Cinderella adjusted by doing less. She had survived by minimizing herself before. This was only a larger stage. The prince visited often, but never intrusively. He spoke to her as if she were already real, not a symbol waiting to be explained. That unsettled her more than cruelty ever had. Abuse followed rules. Recognition did not. He asked about her childhood once. She answered carefully, describing events without emotion. Facts were safer than memories. He did not press. Instead, he listened the way people do when they are deciding whether to believe you. The court, however, believed only what was useful. They began rewriting her story almost immediately. Her past softened in retellings. Hardship became humility. Neglect became preparation. Suffering was reframed as character development. Cinderella heard versions of herself circulate that sounded convincing and false in equal measure. She understood the purpose. Pain is acceptable only when it flatters the present. Preparations for marriage moved forward with ceremonial efficiency. Dresses were designed. Alliances calculated. The kingdom needed reassurance that the disruption she represented would resolve into tradition. Cinderella was expected to become proof that the system worked. At night, alone again, she felt the old tension return. The pressure to perform gratitude, to accept safety as compensation for silence. She recognized the pattern too well. When she requested to visit her former home, the court resisted politely. There were risks, they said. Appearances to manage. She insisted anyway. not emotionally. Logically. A queen, she argued, should understand where she came from. The house looked smaller than she remembered. Not because it had changed, but because she had. The stepmother greeted her with composure that bordered on admiration. Control respects power, even when it loses. They spoke briefly, cordially. No apologies were offered. None were requested. Closure was unnecessary. Cinderella was no longer shaped by what had been done to her. That chapter had ended the moment she stopped waiting to be chosen. When she returned to the palace, something had shifted. Not in the world, but in her. She no longer confused visibility with safety. On the morning of the coronation announcement, Cinderella did not dress immediately. She stood at the window, watching the city prepare to celebrate a story they thought they understood. She understood it too. That was what frightened her. Because stories end, and she was no longer willing to disappear inside one. Refusal did not arrive as defiance. It arrived as clarification. Cinderella asked for time. The court responded with confusion disguised as concern. Time was expensive. Time introduced uncertainty. The advisors spoke of tradition, of stability, of what the people needed. Cinderella listened, as she always had, until listening no longer served her. She pointed out something simple: the kingdom had survived before it knew her name. It would survive a delay. The prince supported her publicly and questioned her privately. He wanted to understand whether her hesitation was fear or strategy. She told him the truth. It was neither. It was recognition. She had spent her life being moved from place to place by other people's decisions. She would not begin ruling by surrendering that ground again. The engagement remained announced. The coronation did not. This unsettled everyone. Without ceremony to anchor it, Cinderella became something undefined. She walked the palace freely. She spoke with servants without performance. She observed council meetings without contributing, learning who spoke to be heard and who spoke to decide. Patterns emerged quickly. Power, she noticed, relied on momentum. Once interrupted, it revealed its seams. She began making small changes, not reforms, adjustments. Kitchen schedules shifted to reduce waste. Guard rotations altered to reduce exhaustion. Nothing dramatic enough to provoke resistance. Everything practical enough to succeed. People noticed outcomes before they noticed intent. Respect followed function. The court recalibrated its perception of her. She was no longer a story being prepared. She was a variable being accounted for. That distinction mattered. The stepmother wrote once. A polite letter. Observant. Complimentary. Cinderella did not reply. Some conversations exist only to restore balance to the speaker. She had no obligation to provide that service anymore. The glass slipper was displayed in the palace as artifact. Visitors admired it reverently. Cinderella passed it often without looking. It had served its purpose. She did not need it to remember who she was. One evening, she removed it from display. There was no announcement, no replacement. By morning, questions circulated. Explanations were offered on her behalf. None were confirmed. She stored the slipper somewhere unremarkable. Among tools. Objects used, not worshipped. When asked why, she answered simply it was never meant to last. The prince understood then that loving her would not mean possessing her. It would mean adapting alongside her. He agreed without promise. Agreement, she had learned, was more reliable than vows. The kingdom adjusted slowly. People always do. And Cinderella, who had once survived by becoming invisible, now ruled by refusing to vanish again. This was not the ending they expected. It was the one that endured. Stability did not come from ceremony. It came from repetition. Weeks passed without proclamation. And the kingdom continued functioning. Markets opened. Disputes were settled. Crops were counted. The absence of spectacle revealed something uncomfortable. The system did not require constant performance to survive. It required attention. Cinderella gave it that. She sat through petitions without interruption. She asked follow-up questions others avoided. Not to trap, but to understand. When answers contradicted each other, she noted it silently. Truth, she had learned, often emerged from inconsistency. Those who attempted to flatter her lost interest quickly. Praise had never kept her alive. Those who spoke plainly found themselves returning, invited back into rooms where decisions were actually made. Resistance appeared gradually. It always does. Some nobles complained of her informality. A ruler, they argued, should inspire awe. Cinderella countered with results. Taxes stabilized. Theft declined. Labor disputes resolved faster because workers were heard before desperation forced them to act. Or, she suggested, was a poor substitute for trust. The advisors adjusted their language. They began using her phrasing in meetings. Influence spreads fastest when it feels self-originated. Cinderella allowed the illusion. Control did not require credit. The prince remained beside her. Not above, not behind. He learned when to speak and when to step aside. Their relationship unsettled observers because it lacked visible hierarchy. That, more than policy, made people nervous. One night, he asked her whether she still feared disappearing into the role. She considered it honestly. No, she said. I fear becoming comfortable. Comfort, she explained, was how blindness formed. She would not mistake peace for safety again. A drought struck the eastern region that summer. Previous administrations would have delayed response until losses could be measured and blamed. Cinderella sent aid immediately. Grain moved before scarcity became spectacle. Lives were preserved quietly. No statues were built. Stories spread anyway. Not the romantic ones. The practical ones. A ruler who listened. A palace that answered letters. A court that no longer pretended ignorance was wisdom. Cinderella visited the hearth less often now. But she kept ash beneath her nails deliberately. A reminder, not of suffering, but of memory, of what happens when silence is mistaken for consent. When the coronation finally occurred, it was understated. No glass, no prophecy, just a crown placed without excess weight. Cinderella accepted it without bowing her head. She did not rise transformed. She rose continued. And in that continuity, the kingdom found something rarer than magic. It found permanence. Permanence invited scrutiny. Once the novelty faded, expectations sharpened. Stability gave people time to look closer, to ask whether what endured deserved to. Cinderella welcomed this quietly. Endurance, she believed, should withstand examination. She instituted no grand reforms. Instead, she dismantled habits. Councils were shortened. Decisions were documented. Silence was no longer interpreted as agreement. Those who had thrived on ambiguity found themselves exposed. Mistakes surfaced. Some hers. When they did, she acknowledged them publicly, not ceremonially. Factually, correction followed explanation. The court struggled with this at first. Admission had long been mistaken for weakness. Cinderella reframed it as calibration. Trust deepened. Not universally. Never universally. There were factions that resented her refusal to perform authority theatrically. They missed fear. Fear had been predictable. It had kept people manageable. Cinderella's calm complicated things. People who were not afraid asked inconvenient questions. Plots formed in rooms she never entered. She learned of them anyway. Information flowed differently now. Not upward through ambition, but sideways through familiarity. Servants spoke. Messengers lingered. Patterns repeated. She did not punish immediately. She waited. When the moment came, it was unremarkable. Positions reassigned. Influence redistributed. No public trials. No dramatic falls. Power was removed the same way it had once been applied to her life, quietly, decisively, without spectacle. The court noticed. They adjusted again. One evening, alone with the prince, she admitted something she had never spoken aloud. That she did not believe in happy endings. She believed in sustainable ones. He smiled. Not because it was comforting, but because it was accurate. They married eventually. Not to seal a story, but to align governance. Their partnership was written into law clearly enough that no one could mistake it for symbolism. Succession was addressed early. Transparency replaced myth. Children were born later. Into a household that did not confuse obedience with love. Cinderella watched them carefully. Not with fear, but with intent. She corrected gently. She listened deliberately. She remembered what neglect had cost her. The hearth remained in the palace. Not decorative. Functional. On certain evenings, when the work was done, Cinderella sat near it. Hands warm. Ash present but no longer consuming. She did not romanticize the past. She did not erase it either. History, she knew, became dangerous only when denied. The glass slipper was never recovered. No one asked anymore. Stories changed over time. They always do. Some softened her edges. Some sharpened them. Cinderella did not intervene. Control over narrative was less important than control over consequence. Long after those who remembered her as a girl were gone, the kingdom still functioned with an unfamiliar steadiness. Not perfect, but attentive. And that, she decided, was the truest form of magic she would ever allow. Attentiveness aged well. As decades passed, the kingdom grew accustomed to governance that did not rely on fear or fantasy. New generations found it unremarkable that rulers explained themselves. That policies shifted when conditions changed. What had once felt radical became background. That was success, Cinderella believed. When effort disappeared into normality, she aged without retreating. Her presence changed subtly. Less motion, more gravity. People listened faster now. Not because of authority alone, but because time had proven her consistent. She had not reinvented herself to stay admired. She had stayed legible. When famine struck neighboring lands, refugees arrived at the borders cautiously. They expected gates and conditions. What they found instead were assessments and logistics. Food before paperwork. Shelter before allegiance. Some advisors warned of precedent. Cinderella acknowledged it. Yes, she said. That's the point. The kingdom absorbed strain and adapted. Systems were stressed, then improved. Mistakes were made, then corrected. Nothing collapsed. Nothing was hidden. The prince grew ill later. Slowly. There was no drama in it. They adjusted roles as they always had. He stepped back where needed. She stepped forward without ceremony. Love, she had learned, was clearest when it required change. When he died, the court prepared for mourning rituals. Cinderella shortened them. Grief, she said, was private work. The kingdom needed continuity more than performance. She grieved anyway. Deeply. Quietly. At the hearth. Time thinned her circle. Advisors retired. Children grew into roles of their own. She resisted legacy building. Statues. She refused. Schools. She approved. Infrastructure outlived monuments. Near the end, she commissioned one final change. All royal records were rewritten to include dissenting notes. Marginalia preserved. Decisions contextualized. History, she insisted, should show uncertainty alongside outcome. On her last evening, she asked to be left alone by the fire. Ash rested lightly on her hands again. Familiar and harmless now. She did not review her life. She assessed it. She had not escaped power. She had learned to carry it without becoming it. When she died, the announcement was brief. No prophecy was invoked. No object symbolized her passing. The kingdom paused, then continued. Children still heard stories of Cinderella. Some ended with romance. Some with magic. A few spoke of ashes and attention and quiet correction. Those were the truest ones. And they endured. Endurance created echoes. Long after her death, decisions were still argued by asking what she would have noticed first. Not what she would have said. Notice. Attention had been her sharpest instrument. And it lingered in the culture like a habit no one questioned anymore. The hearth remained lit in the palace. Maintained by protocol rather than sentiment. New rulers sat near it during difficult deliberations. Not out of reverence, but because the space had become associated with thinking slowly. Fires discourage haste. They remind you that warmth takes time. Children of the court learned the story differently now. Not as a rescue. Not as a reward. But as a case study. Teachers spoke of structural neglect. Of silence mistaken for consent. Of how systems train people to disappear. Cinderella's name appeared in margins beside policies. Not as myth, but as precedent. Some resisted that framing. They preferred the older version. The cleaner one. The girl. The dress. The shoe. The ending. Those stories still circulated. They always would. Simpler narratives survive because they demand less responsibility. But they no longer governed. Across the kingdom, small practices persisted. Officials documented uncertainty. Servants were promoted into advisory roles. Requests were answered, even when denied. Especially when denied. Explanation had become expectation. This did not create utopia. It created friction. And friction, unlike fantasy, produced heat. Occasionally, during periods of instability, someone would suggest returning to spectacle. A grand gesture. A symbolic act to reassure the people. The proposal would be debated, then quietly set aside. Experience had taught them that reassurance fades. Structure remains. No glass artifacts were displayed anymore. They shattered too easily. Instead, tools were honored. Ledgers. Keys. Maps marked with revisions. In the countryside. Among people who never saw the palace. Cinderella was remembered differently still. As a ruler who sent grain before asking questions. As a name attached to fair measurements. As a reason winter did not claim as many lives as it once had. No one built her a shrine. They built systems. And systems. Maintained. Outlast devotion. if magic existed at all. It was this that a child once erased learned not how to be seen, but how to see, and that seeing, applied patiently, repeatedly, reshaped a world that had underestimated silence. The story did not end. It stabilized. And in that stabilization, something rare happened. People stopped waiting to be saved. There was no final lesson written into law. What remained was subtler than that. Generations later, when hardship surfaced, as it always did, people no longer searched for a single figure to resolve it for them. They looked instead at process, at who was listening, at what had been ignored too long. Responsibility had dispersed, and with it, so had power. The story of Cinderella survived, but it changed shape depending on who told it. Two children. It was still about loss and transformation. But the transformation no longer hinged on rescue. It hinged on refusal. Refusal to accept erasure as fate. Two scholars. It was about systems. About how quiet compliance sustains harm, and how attention disrupts it. About how endurance, when paired with agency, becomes leverage. Two rulers. It was a warning. Not that suffering will be rewarded, but that suffering, once understood, will no longer tolerate repetition. The hearth eventually went cold. Not because it was abandoned, but because the palace no longer needed a single place to remember. The lesson had spread into routine, into expectation, into how people treated those with less voice than themselves. Ashes returned to what they had always been. Not symbols, not destiny, just residue. And somewhere, in a world no longer waiting for miracles, a child cleaned a floor and was noticed. Not because of prophecy or spectacle, but because someone remembered to look. That was the inheritance. Not a crown, not a slipper, not a story that ends, but a world slightly less willing to let anyone disappear. Fairy tales don't always end when the story is told. Sometimes, they end when we finally understand them.